this just won't do. It not only hurts my eyes, but it just feels unresponsive, especially in the menus, and it feels like some of my inputs just aren't working. However, I'm not a peasant, and I'm not stuck to the console limitations of the day, and I have a lucky patch. Michael here, and today on The Hacking, we are going to be talking about a 60 FPS patch for Phantasy Star Portable 2. And if you just want to know the actual patch and how to actually apply it, I will be going over that first, and then after that, I'll be talking about the technical details and how I came up with it and how I made it, because I actually did make this patch myself, which was quite nice. And so I'll talk about some methods and things along those lines and how I actually went through it. But if you're looking for just the patch, here is the patch for Phantasy Star Portable 2. There's the patch for Portable 1 as well. I didn't make that one, but it will become relevant later in our discussion. But yeah, so Portable 1 or Portable 2 here. And so there you go. So just go ahead and copy that code. It'll also be in the description of the video. And I did make this code myself. And so if you need help with this code, go ahead and leave a comment or go ahead and join us on the Broken Chat Box Discord, which will be in the description as well. So we will be talking about it on there. If you need help, just go on there and jump around and be like, hey, I need help with this patch. And somebody will get to you eventually. We all have busy lives, so I don't know when. But yeah, so let's go ahead and talk about how to actually apply the patch. So I'm going to go ahead and close my normal emulation there because that is my currently patched version. However, if you want PSP, and this is assuming you've never actually used it before, you know, this is just to make clear, this is on a brand new install, so you go to download and everything. There's Windows. I'm going to be using the Windows version. However, this does work on Android, and you can patch it into the original PSP version of the game. However, one, you need a custom firmware on the PSP to actually do that sort of stuff. And number two, on Android, it's actually going to have a lot of performance problems on a lot of devices, and so I don't necessarily recommend it. However, you can enable the 60 FPS patch, and in PSP settings, you can enable frame skipping, and then you won't get slowdown when your frame rate goes down because the speed of the game is tied to frame rate, which is a little bit upsetting. And then basically on the PSP, eventually it will crash because the PSP just cannot handle it. You'll be running the game at like 0.2% speed or whatever the fuck, and it just does not run whatsoever. And so, yeah, I don't necessarily recommend that. But anyways, let's go ahead and go into our brand new install. So I actually have to extract it. So you just go ahead and extract the files and everything. So, oops. Wow, I freaking missed the button. Of course I would, because I'm recording a video, and why wouldn't I screw it up? So if we're going to go ahead and here. I'm going to do one thing real quick just for me. I'm going to go ahead and use Vulkan because Vulkan is pretty dang good in PSP, at least in the current version that I'm using. Now, I'm going to assume you already have the game extracted and you already know how to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my game files to where I ended up storing the game because you will need the ISO. I'm going to go ahead and load it up real quick, but that's not actually a big deal because I'm going to go ahead and close this. I also want to copy over my save data, and so that we don't have to wait through the intro of that. So I'm going to just go ahead and copy that over into my save file and everything. So there we go. And then I'm going to also get this out of my way just so it's not there on my screen. So there we go. So now I have my save and everything. So we are on a brand new install of PSP with my game and everything. Now there are two things we need to do before we actually go into it. One, we want to go into our settings and we want to make sure that one, I want to have the show FPS counter on. This is for display purposes. The first time, I'm going to set it to both as well. The first time you apply this patch, make sure to have this on just so that you know it's working. This is for the US version of the game, and it will not work for other region versions. And so you will need a US version. If you want to actually know how to make it for other versions, I'll go over that a little bit later, but that'll be later in the video. I'm going to go ahead and set my volume down to 7 just because I'm recording and I want it lower. And then in system, this is very important, make sure to enable cheats or else we won't be able to access the cheats menu. We'll see a little bit later. Then once that's done, go ahead and go into your emulator. Boom, we're going to start it up here. You'll notice it's running at 30 FPS or whatever. Just hit escape or open your menu, whatever you have that toggle to. Just go to cheats. We're going to go over to edit cheat file, and that will bring up Notepad or whatever your default editor is. If you are on Android, it'll bring up a separate window, and then you will type in our little code that we have here. And so I'm just going to copy and paste it. Once again, it should be in the description below. And anyways, I'm going to make sure there's no extra spaces beforehand because my friend had problems with it where when there was a space, for some reason, it just didn't work. But yeah, now that we're here, we can hit Control S or we can hit File and Save. And now once we go into Continue, it will actually notice that it's at 60 FPS automatically because I have enabled so that it will just be 60 FPS. So once we end up getting into the game, it'll be running at 60 FPS. Now there is one thing to note about that. If you end up going on to here, the C1 here that you end up seeing, I'm going to bring it up on the other one because it's zoomed in and everything. hit start there. We'll just go ahead and start loading the game in the background. But the C1 here just shows that it is enabled by default. If you want to make it so it's not enabled by default, just go ahead and set this 1 to a 0. So you can just type in 0 there, and then it won't start it enabled. And I also have a 30 FPS patch here as well, so that because the multiplayer inside the game actually runs at 20 FPS, and while that won't be relevant now, it actually is relevant later. But this works in multiplayer, this works in single player, it works throughout the entire game. Every once in a while, you'll notice that when you're loading into a new zone, I'll talk about why it does this a little bit later, but you'll notice that it drips down to 30 FPS when it's in the loading screens every once in a while, but everywhere else it's running at 60 FPS. And my capture is kind of screwing up because the current version of PSP actually has some frame pacing issues, but you can actually see the speed counter at the top right. It is running at 60 FPS. So there you go. Yeah, that's how to apply the patch. If you just want the patch, there you go. It works in multiplayer. Everything's working. I know there's been other 60 FPS patches, and I did try to use those in the past, and me and my friend were actually trying to use them. However, they had a bunch of issues with them. And playing the multiplayer at 20 FPS, especially on a PC, on an emulator, just was not satisfying whatsoever. And so I went ahead and made my own patch. And so there you go. Now, one thing to note is it does change some default values that only change once within the game. So if you want to actually enable 30 FPS, that's why this is here. And if you have trouble running it at 60 FPS on your machine, just go ahead and enable the 60 FPS one and then exit out. And then if you want to disable the cheat entirely, you actually have to go into the cheats. For one, toggle 30 FPS so that it ends up turning back on those defaults, because the 30 FPS version of the cheat does enable those defaults again, and then just go ahead and untoggle it, and then you can go in and it won't have any of the cheats, and it'll be running at the abysmal 30 FPS, which is unfortunate, but there you go. So I'm going to go ahead and reboot it, because now I'm going to go ahead on how I actually made this cheat. And so there's actually a really, really cool feature here that we can actually go into, and it is called the Dissembler. So up in the top left is the debug, and you're going to be going to Dissembler. And so here we go. We're in here. Also, these cutscenes run at 60 FPS. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But when we go into the Dissembler, we're actually able to go into and actually see where all the registries are and all the basic functions and stuff, which is actually really, really cool. And it has a full memory view here, which is pretty useless unless you know exactly what you're looking for. But we know exactly what we're looking for because we have our code here. And I actually have some really old notes. Unfortunately, I wrote most of my notes down on a notepad, and I lost that notepad while I was moving into my current place, and so I don't have all those notes, but I do have the basic stuff here, and so that's good enough. I had to dig through my archives to find it. But anyway, so here there's actually a really cool thing that I found out when searching about the PSP. There is a function called display wait v blank, and so basically what that does is it kind of skips frames, basically, is a rundown of it. But we can actually find that function in the function list, and that will allow us to actually find the sort of code that we want very quickly. So we'll go ahead and double click this one, and it will actually show us the wait or whatever. I believe it uses this one. And so then when we end up clicking the break button, it'll end up breaking whenever it's skipping a frame. So right now it's running at 60 FPS, and then when we go out, it's going to end up pausing, because now it's going to try and skip, because this menu, if I go ahead and continue the emulation, this menu runs at 30 FPS. And so I was able to find that and be like, all right, cool. So it is kind of waiting, and it's using this function. However, the interesting thing about this game is most games only use this. And so they set a variable once, and so it'll be like, oh, hey, we want to run it at 30 FPS, and then they run the game completely through at 30 FPS. The thing is, Phantasy Star Portable 2 has multiple frame rate modes. And so what they ended up doing is they used not a dynamic variable, but they used a variable that ends up changing. And so it ends up being a 1 for 60 FPS, 2 for 30 FPS, and 3 for 20 FPS. And so the way that ends up doing is it's a division. And so basically, for 2, basically if it's like, all right, so we're rendering this frame, and what it ended up doing is when I was actually looking for this code, I would be through the wait blinker or whatever, and then I found the set mode. Now what I was actually doing is I was going linearly up the code line, which took forever, and it was an idiotic way to do it, because you'll see set display set mode. That seems pretty obvious, but within this code was actually where my first variable was, which I'm not going to go and find it right now because it's a pain in the butt, but you'll notice I actually found this code within there itself. And so I ended up finding this variable, and it's just 1. So we can actually go to its memory location, which we can go into here, go to it, end up hitting enter, and then we'll end up go to it, and it's a V-flash. And then we can go and right click it, and then we go down to go to memory view, and you can actually see right here it is at 2 currently, or whatever. So that is the game speed of it. So what do? Set this to a 1. Boom, we're running at 60 FPS. So right now what this is doing is it's telling it to not skip frames. So basically what it ended up doing, I think, is it tells it to like render how many frames this render is going to last for. And so you can end up setting this to 3 or whatever, and you'll notice it goes down to 20 FPS, and the game is just incredibly slow at that point. But there you go. So we'll just go ahead and go into 1 speed. Now, the interesting thing about this is that while that's running at 60 FPS, you'll notice that it's running a little bit faster than it should be, which is kind of nice for our purposes here because we just want to go into the game real quick. But you'll notice it's running at double speed. That's not very functional. And you'll notice it also switches here. This is why it's a cheat code and not a hard hack. Now, there are other valuables that you could change, and this is why it's not an ISO patch. But we'll just go ahead and change that back to 1. What PSP actually does for this cheat is it actually just makes it so it's constantly changing that variable. So that's the thing that's going on. But yeah, so now we're running at double speed, which, I mean, as hilarious as that is, and some people would love that for grinding, it's not very useful for our purposes. And so we're going to go ahead and find our other variables. So how did I end up doing that one? This is where it gets a little bit complicated. Do I have it open anymore? I do not. I need to go and grab it real quick. There we go. I don't have no idea what that's going to do to the capture. It's probably just going to go black for a second. I apologize. But this is where I opened my dedicated cheat engine, which is a nice little loyal friend for this sort of thing. And so basically what you ended up doing, or what you would have to end up doing, is you would have to find the offset, and there is a setting specifically in cheat engine you would have to enable. So if you're going to use my method, you would go into file or edit and then settings, and then you would go to scan settings and ensure that mem mapped would be enabled, or else you will not find the memory, or at least it won't be consistent. It will change all the time, which is a little bit annoying. Also, another function that you can end up using with cheat engine is you can actually right click down in the memory view and click dump, and you can dump your entire RAM or VRAM into a file. And then what you can do is you can use comparisons between those, and that actually, I didn't know that the first time I made this patch, and so my patch process was insane. But, you know, once I figured that out, it was actually pretty easy. But what I ended up doing was I actually ended up making a save state inside. I'm going to assume you know how to use cheat engine. What I ended up doing is I made a save state within single player, and then I made a save state within multiplayer. And so the single player was running at 30 FPS, and the multiplayer was running at 20 FPS. And I found my variables. And so basically I found variables that would modify different ones. So what I ended up finding was I found the movement distance, or actually, no, I don't think it was movement distance. I think I found the animation speed first. And so I found this one, and I'm like, all right, cool. So why is that relevant? I was able to find that one, and I was like, all right, cool. And then I ended up finding movement speed. And so once I ended up finding movement speed, I'm like, all right, well, what is this actually going to do for me, right? Well, the interesting thing about this is I noticed that somebody made a patch for the first one, and I noticed something very, very interesting. They're 8 bits apart, which means that these variables were all stored in the same location. And so while in this memory here, it's just absolute jargon around it, this is a bunch of other functions and stored variables, the code actually has stored variables and then code functions and then stored variables. And so what we can end up doing is we could just find the movement distance variable, which is going to be in this location here, no instruction because it is a variable. And then we go to the memory view, and then there we actually have all of our variables just sitting neatly right next to each other. Now, the interesting part about this is the guy that made the original portable thing. I apologize, I forgot his name. I had it before I started recording, and I just completely forgot it. So I apologize, dude, that made the patch for the first one. But he tried making a patch for the second one, and he just did exactly the same thing. However, he missed a few variables, and they were in different spots. And so basically, I just ended up looking at that, and I'm like, all right, cool. Well, what variables did he use? And then I looked for other variables that were along the same lines. So the way these variables work is, as you can see here, these are actually floats. So some of these are floats, and so this is a float, this is a float, and this one is a float. And so these ones are just basically values that they would use to multiply onto their physics or animation engine. And so that would end up slowing it down to the appropriate speed, or speeding it up to the appropriate speed, depending on how they set it. And so once again, 1.0 is going to be the absolute max speed, which is 60 FPS. The PSP was capped at 60 FPS, so they knew they weren't going to go above that. That's also why the minimum value is 1. It's not something like some weird variable or whatever. And this is one of the reasons why getting anything above 60 FPS is going to be impossible. But once again, the PSP itself wouldn't go above 60 FPS anyways. And then they also used integer values as well. And so what this ended up doing was it would change it for the variables. And I have a nice little note at the bottom here. So 1 is 60 FPS, 2, it would be basically every 2 frames is when it would render and when it would calculate. And then third frame, or 3, would be 20 FPS. And so every third frame, it would calculate all of these animations. And so once again, that's like the animation and action variables. And so, for example, the photon bursts inside the game actually calculate based off of the frame rate, and so the frame timings would use that. However, the damage is still calculated based on one of these other values. I don't remember exactly which one because, once again, my notes are lost inside of a notebook in a trash bin somewhere because I moved and just got rid of it, and so I apologize for that, but there you go. Actually, it might be in my mother's house because she stored some of my stuff. Anyways, back on topic. So that's how we can do it. So let's go ahead and enable this patch manually. So we already did the 60 FPS, so it's running at 60 FPS. So let's go ahead and find our movement speed value, which is going to be right here. And so right here, we actually see the default value for the 30 FPS. And you'll see that I have that as my value in the 30 FPS patch as well. So it's down here right there. However, we want to change it to this. So what we're going to need to do to actually make this work is we're going to need to format. God, it's so annoying having to tab out of it. But there you go. So you'll actually see the 4 values that we're looking for are right there. And so basically these 4 numbers here from the 0 all the way over to the 1 is the values that we're going to be using. So if we end up tabbing over to our value here, we'll actually notice that that doesn't look properly. Like that just doesn't look proper. So what we want to do is we actually need to format it so it works within code or assembly. And so basically what we'll end up doing is it will divide it into little bytes here, and then it will render those, or not render those, but draw those in a single line. So it'll basically be, to layman's terms, it will be 0, 0, and then it would go into the next line, 0, 0, and then we'll go into the next line, 7, 0, and then we'll go into the next line, and then it would be 4, 2. And so we'll just go ahead and change those values here. You can see it is currently 0, 0, 0, 0, F, 0, 4, 1. So we'll just change this to a 7, 0, and then a 4, 2. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. And then all of a sudden you'll notice that our movement distance, at least, including the camera distance, is going to be proper now, because that is the distance that it is properly doing. However, the animation speed is still kind of wonky. Now, I'm not going to do all of these, but this is how to manually do it as well. And so this is how I was able to like test out the values and stuff. And I used a Hex Calculator. And so once again, my little calculator over here. Oh, I need to bring it over. I use this calculator over here, which is just a Windows calculator. You can end up clicking in the top left corner here and go down to Programmer. This is also in the Windows 7 version as well. And then you can go to Hex, and you can actually use this to end up calculating your floats. There is an algorithm and everything like that that you use to get a float value within Hex, and this calculator will end up doing that for you, which is super, super nice. And so I just ended up using that, and so that's how that went along. Now, you'll also notice an interesting thing, though, how I have these memory values. You'll notice that that's not the same as this value that I have over here. Oh, so I should probably fix my animation speed real quick. So which one was animation speed? This one was. So we'll just do this real quick just to make it so that our character doesn't look wonky. Right click and go to memory view, and there it is there. So it was a 0 and 8. We need to turn it into a 3 and an F. Is that correct? I hope that's correct. No, that is not correct. It is, oh no, we need to make it to 3F, but it is 8, 0, 3F. Okay, so 0, 0, and then 3F, and then that should be good. There we go. That is the proper emulation speed. Sorry, I got a little bit confused. I'm terrible with numbers sometimes. But regardless, you'll notice that these values are a little bit different as well. The reason is, if you're ever looking at a code and you want to convert it into actually finding it inside this memory view, you need to convert it based off of the offset that you will find into it, because this code is just based off of where the actual in the ISO or whatever is going to be. And then this 2 is actually showing that it's going to be a 4-bit value or whatever. So this is just a single bit value. So it doesn't change any of the other ones. So that's why there's no 2 here. But the actual number that you're going to be concerned with is this number here. And so if I wanted to find, for example, this animation speed code, or let's go ahead and use a simpler one because this one's easier to find. We'll just use this one and then go to memory view. So yeah, once again, we're at this little spot here. So in order to actually find that properly, you would need to have this value here as highlighted. And so that's going to be where it is inside the actual game's like code, where it would be inside the RAM. And then we will go into our calculator here and Control V. I'm not going to type it in because I'm lazy. And then you will do plus 08800000, and that's going to be its memory offset. And then you end up entering, and then you will get your official code that you will find inside of here. Now, if you're going to do the opposite, let's say you find your code inside the actual memory view itself, and this isn't true of all games. Some games have different memory offsets, but I think they're rare cases. This is what it was for this game, so there we go. So we'll do minus 08800000, and then again, we'll get our hex value for our actual code itself. And so there you go. That's where we end up getting that value. And that's essentially it. And then after that, I just noticed that they were all right next to each other. And so I just walked around the actual memory itself and looked for those codes specifically. And so I'm like, all right, so I know it's using one variables and I know it's using float variables. And then I just did the old classic of walking through the code itself. So which is how you would actually patch a usual game if it doesn't actually run off of like DirectX or anything like that. If anything's running off of a normal executable, that would end up working. But yeah, so that's explaining the patch and everything and how I ended up finding it and how you can end up finding it yourself. Sorry, this isn't like as in-depth as like actually making a 60 FPS patch, but if you're interested in this stuff, there you go. That's how it goes. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this one. I also produce a lot of other types of stuff. Also, if you end up liking my content, you can end up going on to Patreon and subscribing for $1 or more. And it ends up helping me out a lot, and it helps me get new games to cover and stuff like that. And it ends up getting me new hardware and things that I can end up using to produce this type of content as well. I noticed that I'm clipping on my microphone a little bit, and that's because my microphone sucks, and I can't afford a better one. So that would end up helping out a lot. And you can also end up joining us on the Broken Chat Box, which is a Discord server. If you want to end up chatting about this sort of type of stuff and you want to end up asking about 60 FPS patches and how to make them and stuff, you can end up heading over there. And some of us are knowledgeable in this stuff. Not everyone. And sometimes we're busy people, and so we don't always get to there. But yeah, it's a fun little gaming community. We do gaming nights and stuff. So if you want to end up joining us for that, you can. Like I said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Also, easily leave inside the comments what you would like me to hack next, and maybe I can get to it. The next hack I'm going to do is frame, or not a frame rate hack, but a resolution hack for Phantasy Star Universe, just because I already did it and I'm going to do it. And it's just Phantasy Star related, and I like Phantasy Star. So, yeah, we'll do that one next. Anyway, see ya.